In a recent op-ed for The Hill, former U.S. Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom from 2018 to 2021 and leading figure in the Christian conservative movement, Sam Brownback argues that the U.S. should provide critical funds necessary for testing, treating, and vaccinating against COVID to the African continent. Otherwise, China will.
He says China's massive investments in infrastructure in Africa, most of which have taken place over the last decade, serve to extend Beijing's political and economic interests, and that the U.S. must get ahead when it comes to COVID relief if it wants to halt Africa's dependence on the CCP. Ambassador Brownback, who's also former governor and senator for Kansas, joins us now to expand on this. Welcome, Ambassador.
Thank you. Good to join you.
And so even though you are a leading figure in the Christian conservative movement, it might be surprising for viewers to learn that it's actually the socialist here on the set who first wanted to have you on. Emily was also excited to talk to you. But I'm really intrigued by your proposal. You talk about using the IMF as a mechanism to get significant amounts of aid into Africa at an extremely crucial moment for the people there. Have you found some kind of cross-partisan support for this idea?
Well, I've found initially a lot more support on the Democrat side of the aisle than I have on the Republican side of the aisle, but it makes eminent sense. We're in a global superpower competition with China. They have really invested heavily in Africa. They want to push their authoritarian, mercantilist model that they have, and they're using every tool and means that they have, and particularly the economic ones. And now we have a time of crisis in Africa with the COVID. Less than 5% of the continent is vaccinated. They need help. We need to be there with them and for them, or we will continue to lose, I think, standing and impact in a continent that's really in play, whether it's going to go a democratic, open economy model or this authoritarian, mercantilist model that the Chinese are pushing.
And obviously, from your perspective and from my perspective, there is hostility from the CCP to religion in general, and particularly to Muslims and Christians. Yes. So that's something that would be a threat if they exert more and more control over the African continent. And COVID is just one part of the broader Chinese initiative to gain more and more control over the African continent. Can you speak to that and expound on what the threat is to the United States, to global freedom, if there is a heightened Chinese presence in Africa?
Well, there's a huge threat. And they're putting in these systems now in place to be able to control people's movement, their economy. They've got facial recognition cameras everywhere. They've got, and they're moving to digitize their currency so they could track all of the actual financial transactions. And they want that model of authoritarian control to expand around the world, and they're playing big in Africa. That hurts us if you get more countries going into this authoritarian model. Plus, there's just the raw resource issue that China has been after for decades now in Africa, tying up these raw resources for their global economic dominance that they seek.
Is the resource issue one that you find resonating on the right? If you appeal to kind of naked national self-interest, and if the economy is moving away from fossil fuel based and into clean energy, you're going to need resources for batteries and other things. Are you finding that resonating with the right in the U.S., that's where the competition is between the U.S. and China?
You know, what I find resonates is this idea that we actually are in this global superpower competition, and China has a different model of governance and ideas on human rights. They don't believe in human rights. They believe in community rights as they define what the community rights are. And people in the United States are good-hearted. They want people to be free. And they're seeing in this situation now the Chinese control model being pushed, gaining sway, particularly in authoritarian areas and regimes, and they don't like it. Just like when we confronted the Soviet Union, they didn't like what the Soviet Union was doing to people, free people around the world, and they don't like what the Chinese Communist Party is doing to free people around the world.
The Soviet example is an interesting one because this argument does probably sound to some people on the right where there's kind of a realignment going on. It probably almost sounds neoconservative, that we have to increase, we have to hold off this threat, this communist threat from other parts of the world to preserve our freedoms here. Have you found that it's sort of more difficult to make these arguments on the right in this era of almost an isolationism, where there's this idea that why should we be, trying to push all of this funding from the IMF that we give money to go into China when our own problems seem so severe here at home? Is it more difficult to make this pitch now?
I don't think it is. I mean, if we're talking about nation building, that's a hard argument to make, and I'm not making that argument. If you talk about free will and free souls, that's not a hard argument to make. Look what the Chinese are doing to the Muslims in Xinjiang, the Uyghurs. They're putting them in concentration camps. They have a virtual police state around them, and they are exporting that model of religious persecution and oppression. Do we want to see that model all over Africa? As a person who takes my faith very seriously, I follow Jesus. I want to see liberty. I want to see freedom for people of all faiths. Even if I don't agree with their faith, I want to see their chance to be able to pursue that. And we want to see that in the African continent. And to me, that's the real heart of the argument, is that freedom of your soul to do as you see fit. And China's seeking to put that authoritarian controlling model on top of people.
I'm with you on that.
Can you talk a little bit about the mechanism? Emily mentioned the IMF. You advocate for using the IMF's kind of special drawing rights, which would allow countries in need to draw additional funds than normal from the IMF. Why use the IMF as the mechanism for this policy goal?
They have a mechanism. We have used this mechanism in times of economic difficulty before. In 2008, when we had the global freezing of the economies around the world, the IMF used this to be able to put capital and to move countries on forward. So we have this mechanism. It exists. It then really broadens the scope and the cost of it. And that's why I think this is really quite a perfect mechanism to use it. And one other thing I want to throw out, I worked with President Bush, W. Bush, on the PEPFAR program, where we helped out really with the AIDS and malaria crisis in Africa. It was enormously successful. We saved over 18 million lives with that. And you know what? It really helped our popularity in Africa, and it was good for our soul to help them in the time of crisis. This one's not that much different from that. And we should do this again. And this IMF tool really is target made for this type of intervention.
And one quick question before we wrap on a very broad issue. You've worked on these matters so closely. Can you speak to what you saw in terms of how China treats people of faith? I mean, a lot of people know about the sort of high-profile Muslim examples, but the CCP has a problem with really religion in general, faith in general. What does that look like in China?
It looks terrible. They're at war with faith. And I pointed out to them and many others, it's a war they will not win, but they put high-profile pastors in prison. They put human rights lawyers in prison. People disappear. They have organ harvesting of groups like the Falun Gong and others that are taking place. I mean, communism is officially atheistic, and they are enforcing that model, and they want no allegiance to any other authority higher than the state. And if you're a person of faith, I love my country, but I follow the Lord. And that's really what is just anathema to them. They cannot withstand, they do not like that, and they won't tolerate it.
And I think one thing everybody can agree on, I think, is that PEPFAR really was a signature achievement that saved millions of lives. And if there's a way to replicate that success, there seems no reason not to do it. Ambassador, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to join you, and I hope people will sign up and push this effort.
And we will have more Rising for you right after this.